Southeast Asia, a land of vibrant economies and diverse cultures, now stands at the crossroads of two superpowers. In 2024, trade between ASEAN and the United States reached $476.8 billion USD, with ASEAN enjoying a trade surplus of $227.7 billion USD, a huge figure that made the U.S. the region's top export market. However, China, with $982 billion USD in trade, has maintained its position as ASEAN's #1 partner for 16 years, from 2008 to 2024. The ICFTA and RCEP agreements have paved the way for Chinese goods to flood the region, from industrial machinery and consumer electronics to cheap clothing. But behind these impressive numbers lies a deadly paradox. ASEAN runs a trade surplus with the U.S., but a trade deficit with China, with a deficit of $134.1 billion USD in just the first 6 months of 2025. The region's economy depends on China, but its security relies on the U.S., a model that seems wise but is full of risks. ASEAN countries have grown accustomed to leveraging both sides. They export high-tech goods to the U.S. while importing raw materials and components from China. Markets in Bangkok, Jakarta, or Manila are flooded with Chinese products, from household goods to construction equipment. But this fragile balance is on the verge of collapse. ASEAN leaders once believed they could forever stand on the dividing line, choosing neither side. But a move from Washington changed all calculations. Dependence on China goes beyond trade. Investments from Beijing through the Belt and Road Initiative have turned many ASEAN countries into debtors. Infrastructure projects, while bringing short-term benefits, come with harsh financial terms. Meanwhile, the U.S., with tariff incentives and security support, remains an indispensable lifeline. But ASEAN has underestimated Washington's role, and this is about to lead to an economic earthquake. A name has emerged and overturned all plans. Who is behind this change? On January 20th, 2025, President Trump was inaugurated for his second term. Just 6 months later, on July 2, 2025, he announced a global reciprocal tariff policy that shocked Southeast Asia. Cambodia faced a 49% tariff, Laos 48%, Thailand 46%, while Singapore enjoyed the lowest rate at 10%. This policy was not only an economic blow, but also a direct challenge to China's soft encirclement strategy, which relies on economic agreements and investment flows to control the region. ASEAN, once confident in its ability to balance the two superpowers, now faces harsh reality. The dream of economic dependence on China and security on the U.S. has vanished. On April 10, 2025, ASEAN economic ministers held an emergency meeting in Jakarta. They decided not to retaliate, but to negotiate for a way out. As a result, within just 3 months, the chessboard began to shift. On August 5, 2025, Thailand signed a trade agreement with the U.S., accepting a minimum tariff of 20%. Cambodia followed. The climax came when U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer declared that President Trump's efforts had ended the border tensions between Thailand and Cambodia, paving the way for a series of new trade agreements. The Philippines and Indonesia also reached agreements, with tariffs reduced to 19%. President Trump's tariff policy targeted not only the economy, but also the loophole of re-exporting Chinese goods through ASEAN to evade U.S. tariffs. Goods from China, previously washed of origin in countries like Laos or Myanmar, are now tightly controlled. ASEAN factories, which depend on Chinese components, are forced to seek new supplies from Japan, South Korea, or even India. This raises the question, can the region escape Beijing's grip, or will it fall into a new cycle of dependence? But what caused China, an economic giant, to suddenly lose ground in Southeast Asia? China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, has invested tens of billions of dollars in Southeast Asia turning the region into its economic backyard. In Cambodia, the Phnom Penh-Sihanoukville Highway worth $2 billion USD, the deep water port of Koh Kong, and the Lower Sasan II hydroelectric dam are testaments to Beijing's presence. Especially the Ream naval base in the Gulf of Thailand, modernized with Chinese funding, has become a focal point of suspicion. Western satellites have recorded the appearance of Type 056 escort ships, new piers, and large repair yards, raising concerns that Beijing is quietly controlling the Malacca Strait, a vital global maritime route. When the Thailand-Cambodia border conflict erupted, Cambodia sought military aid from China. The response was a frightening silence. Why? Thailand is a bigger economic partner, with trade volume of $85 billion USD in 2024, compared to Cambodia's $12 billion USD. Beijing chose economic interests over supporting an ally. Cambodia, once a close partner, became a pawn abandoned on the power chessboard. On July 26, 2025, President Trump personally called the prime ministers of Thailand and Cambodia, demanding an immediate ceasefire. Just 48 hours later, on July 28th, the two countries met in Kuala Lumpur under Malaysia's chairmanship and declared a ceasefire starting at midnight on July 29th. By July 31st, both signed trade agreements with the U.S., marking Washington's diplomatic victory without firing a single shot. China's failure did not stop at Cambodia. ASEAN countries began to realize that dependence on Beijing carries great risks. Loans from China, often with high interest rates and harsh terms, have trapped many countries in debt. Laos, with 13 billion USD in debt from belt and road projects, is a typical example. Projects like the Vientiane-Kunming Railway, while improving transportation, have imposed heavy financial pressure on Laos. Meanwhile, U.S. investments, with more transparent conditions, have become a more attractive option. But what made Cambodia turn its back on China? A secret never before revealed.
The White House issued an executive order establishing new tariff rates: Singapore 10%, Thailand 19%, Brunei 25%, Laos and Myanmar 40%. This policy is not only aimed at punishment, but also targets the strategy of re-exporting Chinese goods through ASEAN. Goods from China, which were previously washed of origin in Laos, Myanmar, or Thailand, are now subject to a 40% tax if re-exported to the U.S., Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, despite having large export volumes to China, lean towards the U.S. due to disputes in the South China Sea. China is becoming increasingly aggressive, with actions such as building artificial islands, deploying warships, and intensifying patrols. Meanwhile, the U.S., with the Pacific Fleet and joint exercises, is the only counterbalance strong enough to deter Beijing. Cambodian Deputy Prime Minister Sokchenda Sophia declared a nomination of President Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, recognizing his role in ending the Thailand-Cambodia conflict. Taiwanese scholar To Tu Vun commented, "President Trump not only wins economically, but also reshapes regional security, shaking the strategic foundation of China in Southeast Asia." The U.S.-ASEAN Economic Forum in Bangkok, with participation from Thailand and Cambodia, is a clear sign that Washington is building a new alliance right in China's backyard. However, not all countries are ready to change. Laos and Myanmar, the two closest countries to Beijing, remain silent. With a 40% tariff from the U.S., they face unprecedented pressure. Factories in Laos, which depend on Chinese raw materials, are beginning to shift to supplies from Japan and South Korea. Myanmar, meanwhile, faces the risk of economic decline due to losing the U.S. export market. Local businesses in Yangon and Mandalay have started calling on the government to negotiate with Washington to ease the pressure. An unexpected move from Laos could change the entire situation. Laos, a small country with an economy heavily dependent on China, has become an ideal gateway for Chinese goods to evade U.S. tariffs. In 2024, China invested $7.8 billion in Laos, mainly through infrastructure projects such as the Vientiane-Kunming Railway. But on July 15, 2025, Laos unexpectedly announced its intention to negotiate a trade agreement with the U.S., accepting a 25% tariff. This move stunned Beijing, as Laos was once considered an unshakable ally. Laos's decision did not come out of nowhere. Its public debt, mainly from Chinese loans, has reached $13 billion, equivalent to 68% of GDP. The Belt and Road projects, while providing modern infrastructure, have pushed Laos into financial dependence. When the U.S. offered a trade proposal with preferential conditions, including debt restructuring support, Laos realized that diversifying its economic relations was the only way to avoid complete control by Beijing.
Myanmar, meanwhile, maintains a loyal stance toward China. With investments of $9.2 billion from Beijing in 2024, Myanmar depends on China to sustain the Kayok Phu port and pipeline projects. However, a 40% tariff from the United States is causing Myanmar's economy to struggle. On July 20, 2025, Myanmar's leaders held a closed-door meeting in Naypyidaw to discuss the possibility of negotiating with Washington. Although no decision has been announced, pressure from the business community and the risk of economic recession are forcing Myanmar to reconsider its strategy. President Trump's tariff strategy is not only economic, but also a political strike. By tightening control over pro-China countries, the U.S. forces ASEAN to choose sides. New trade agreements include clauses preventing Chinese goods from laundering their origin, ensuring there is no easy path for Beijing to access the U.S. market through ASEAN. After signing the agreement, Thailand attracted $15 billion in investment from American companies like Intel and Ford, turning the country into the region's new manufacturing hub. Indonesia and the Philippines also received $10 billion in investment for high-tech projects, ranging from chip manufacturing to renewable energy. However, an unexpected event in August 2025 put both Laos and Myanmar in a difficult position. On August 5, 2025, President Trump announced plans to hold the Asia-Pacific Economic Forum in Singapore in October 2025, inviting all ASEAN countries except Laos and Myanmar. This move was a clear warning. Countries that do not cooperate with the U.S. will be isolated from global economic opportunities. Singapore, as a financial center, became the bridge for new trade agreements between the U.S. and ASEAN. Meanwhile, China tried to counterattack by increasing investment in Laos and Myanmar. On August 10, 2025, Beijing announced a $5 billion aid package for the two countries, focusing on energy and transportation projects. However, the effectiveness of this aid package is doubtful, as Chinese projects often come with high public debt, making Laos and Myanmar increasingly dependent. Moreover, Chinese companies in ASEAN began facing difficulties as countries like Thailand and Indonesia implemented stricter controls on imported Chinese goods. After signing the agreement with the U.S., Thailand became the region's new manufacturing hub. American companies like Apple and Tesla shifted part of their production lines from China to Thailand, with a total investment of $32 billion in 2025. Indonesia and the Philippines also benefited, with semiconductor manufacturing projects worth $15 billion. These countries not only received investment, but also gained access to advanced technology from the U.S., helping them reduce dependence on China. Singaporean scholar Lee Kuan Yew once said, "In geopolitics, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. ASEAN, once a neutral region, is now forced to adjust to survive. Countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines have chosen to side with the U.S., while Laos and Myanmar remain hesitant. However, economic and political pressure from Washington is leaving them with few options. Industrial zones in Thailand and Indonesia are rapidly transforming, shifting from dependence on Chinese components to more diversified sources, including India and South Korea. But a secret from the Asia-Pacific Economic Forum will change everything. The Asia-Pacific Economic Forum opened in Singapore. President Trump personally attended and declared, "The United States will not allow any country to use ASEAN to evade tariffs." He announced plans to establish the Asia-Pacific Economic Alliance, including the U.S., Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN countries that have signed trade agreements. The goal is to create a new free trade zone, eliminating China's influence. President Trump's strategy does not stop at ASEAN. The EU announced plans to impose a 35% tariff on Chinese goods re-exported through third countries. Japan and Canada are also considering similar measures. A new economic order is forming, led by the U.S., with China gradually isolated. Southeast Asia, once a neutral land, is now the center of global change. Singapore, as a financial hub, is becoming the focal point for new trade deals. Thailand and Indonesia, with high-tech manufacturing projects, are leading the region in attracting foreign investment. Japanese companies like Toyota and Sony have committed $12 billion to Indonesia to build electric vehicle battery factories. However, not everything is smooth. China, despite losing influence, still seeks to counterattack. Beijing announced plans to establish a $10 billion investment fund to support ASEAN businesses cooperating with China. But with new trade terms from the U.S. and its allies, this plan is unlikely to compete effectively. ASEAN countries now face a historic choice: continue depending on China with risks of public debt and loss of autonomy, or pivot to the U.S., with opportunities to access new markets and technology. President Trump announced a new initiative, the Pacific Infrastructure Investment Fund, with an initial budget of $50 billion aimed at supporting ASEAN countries to build modern infrastructure without relying on China. This initiative targets port projects, highways, and 5G networks, with commitments to transparency and no public debt. Thailand and the Philippines are the first two countries to receive $10 billion each, focusing on renewable energy and smart transportation projects. This move is a strong blow to China, which relies on infrastructure loans to control the region. Laos, despite recently signing an agreement with the U.S., still struggles with $13 billion of debt to China. Laos announced plans to restructure its debt, with support from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, two U.S.-led organizations. This not only helps Laos reduce financial pressure, but also sends a clear message to Beijing. ASEAN is no longer China's backyard. Meanwhile, Myanmar faces internal pressure. Protests in Yangon demand the government reduce dependence on China. President Trump's strategy has created a domino effect. ASEAN countries, once hesitant, are now collectively turning toward the U.S. Singapore has become the coordination center for new infrastructure projects. Indonesia and Malaysia, with chip manufacturing and renewable energy projects, are attracting investment from Japan and South Korea, two U.S. allies. South Korean companies like Samsung and LG have committed $8 billion to Malaysia to build OLED screen factories. China, though still a major trading partner, no longer holds a dominant position. Chinese companies in ASEAN have begun withdrawing capital, with $20 billion moved out of the region in the last quarter of 2025. Meanwhile, the U.S. and its allies have pledged $100 billion in investment in Southeast Asia over the next 3 years, focusing on technology, clean energy, and sustainable infrastructure. A secret plan from Washington is being prepared to completely change the regional landscape. President Trump announced a new strategy called the Pacific Vision, aimed at strengthening the U.S. position in Southeast Asia. This strategy not only focuses on trade, but also expands into security and technology cooperation. The U.S. commits to deploying high-tech training programs in ASEAN with a budget of $2 billion to support countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines in developing their workforce in artificial intelligence and renewable energy. This initiative has attracted the attention of ASEAN countries. Thailand, with its strategic location and developed economy, has become the region's technology training center. The Thai government announced plans to build an artificial intelligence research center in Bangkok, supported by American companies like Google and Microsoft. This project, valued at $5 billion USD, is expected to create 50,000 new jobs within 5 years. Indonesia, with its large population and economic potential, is also not standing aside. Jakarta signed an agreement with the United States to develop a green industrial park in Surabaya, focusing on solar and wind energy production. This project, with an investment of $7 billion USD, is expected to help Indonesia reduce its dependence on fossil fuels and strengthen its position in the global supply chain. However, not everything is smooth. China, although gradually losing influence, still seeks to maintain its position in Southeast Asia. Beijing announced plans to build a smart port network in ASEAN, with a total investment of $15 billion USD. These ports, equipped with artificial intelligence and blockchain technology, aim to directly compete with U.S. infrastructure projects. However, with new trade terms and pressure from Washington, this plan is unlikely to succeed as expected. ASEAN countries now face a historic choice. They can continue cooperating with China, risking being controlled by public debt and political influence. Or they can completely shift towards the United States, with opportunities to access advanced technology and global markets. But dependence on Washington also raises the question, can ASEAN maintain independence in this new order? This question is not easy to answer. Countries like Singapore and Thailand, with strong economies and strategic positions, can leverage both sides to maximize benefits. But smaller countries like Laos and Myanmar, with limited resources, will face greater pressure. Their choices will shape not only the future of Southeast Asia, but also the global economic order.